Good evening to our viewers. This is Attorney Amihan April Alcazar. This is AAA Live, where your academic goals are advanced and achieved. Follow and subscribe to our YouTube and Facebook channels. So for tonight, we are joined, and it is such a privilege for us to be joined tonight by Assistant Attorney General Wenona Baldenegro of Arizona, and she's representing the Pascua Yaqui tribe. So maybe you can give our viewers some greetings from Arizona, both in your native language and from your state of Arizona. So Assistant Attorney General, please.
Sure. Thank you again for having me. It's a wonderful pleasure to be here with all of you. Again, my name is Wenona Baldenegro. I'm a member of the Navajo Nation. My people live in the northeastern corner of the state of Arizona, and our reservation also goes into the state of New Mexico, the state of Utah, and we cover what's called the Four Corners in the Southwest United States. In my native language, we usually introduce ourselves by our clans. Sheya Wenona Benali and Shea. Tena Jini Nishlin, do Hanatni Bashchi, Hatna Satni Dashiche, do Habahan Dashna. Put ego as Stanishlin. I'm of the Darkwood Street people, born for the one who walks around clan. And on my maternal mother's side of my family, I am near the water's edge of the near the water's edge people. And on my paternal side, grandfather's side, I am which means those who walk around. So those are my clans in my Navajo language.
Yes, thank you so much for informing us of your origins, and of course, you are descendants from the state of Arizona. So I think it's so interesting for us to begin our conversation tonight by really talking about like how you started to have this interest as a young person, because we'll be talking about the indigenous community in general, and then of course your particular Navajo Nation, and how and when, as a young person, did you develop the interest for the protection of the indigenous community and eventually went into the legal field? So maybe you can tell us a little bit of your historical perspective from both a personal and also from your people's perspective. Wenona?
Sure. Well, I'm an attorney by profession, and as I reflected on my educational experience growing up on the Navajo reservation, I have a distinct memory of the moment in which I decided that I wanted to go to law school and become an attorney. And that actually happened very early on for me, as early as high school. And what prompted me to pursue a career in the legal field actually ties into my own family history and some of the tragic events that have taken place, not only for my tribe in the United States, but it happened to many different Indian tribes throughout the United States. When I was in elementary school, I learned for the first time the history of my people, the Navajo people, and our forced removal from our ancestral homelands. And at the time, I was too young to understand the direct connection to my family history. And in large part because, just being young, you don't quite understand the times. You think that everything happened in the ancient past.
Yes.
And, coupled with the fact that my family at the time, my parents, my grandparents, decided not to tell me my full history, our family history, until later on when I was a student in high school. Mm-hmm. And at that time, I had learned for the first time that the forced removal of our people from our homelands that my great-grandfather had been part of that forced removal and actually survived and returned home to our reservation. But more importantly, it was the fact that my mother was alive, or my great-grandfather was alive at the time that my mother was a young girl. So my mother knew my great-grandfather, this this older gentleman who had experienced this horrific event in our history and had survived. And unfortunately, it was taboo, as it is in many cultures and many communities across the world, that when you experience such a tragic event, it becomes taboo to talk about. So she didn't know the stories of his survival, but my grandfather, he had told my grandfather at a later time in life what those stories were, and those stories were handed down to me and my siblings, and I just it was a very eye-opening experience for me to know that the events that I had read in our history books and that I had learned in school, that I actually had a personal family history to tell. And that actually inspired me to learn more about really, how could this happen? How could this happen to my family? How could this happen to our people? How do these sort of events occur, to a large group of people?
Yes.
And of course, that prompted me to learn about the law. It prompted me to learn about the government. And that's when I had sort of, in my educational experience, in my learning experience, I had understood that there was a connection to the law.
Yeah.
And I decided that I wanted to pursue a career in law, in large part because I didn't want this to happen again to our people and certainly other people across the country.
Yes. So maybe we can backtrack a little and talk about like the role of education in that informing you about your decision, because you talked about the Navajo Nation and the Indians, American reservations. And so, in so far as the education and the educational system was concerned, because you said you only in high school found out about the history from personal accounts of your family members. So, how did you think was the role of education all throughout the time that you were growing up, when you did not have information about the history, both of your people and your personal history of the accounts of what had happened to your family?
Well, certainly the educational system has changed even in my lifetime, certainly within the school system located on our reservation. Many people are now becoming familiar with what is known as the boarding schools, the boarding school system in the United States and in Canada. And my generation, we're sort of the tail end of that system, that educational system that existed within many Indian tribal nations in the United States and certainly First Nations people in Canada. But even the boarding school system had changed dramatically by the time, I certainly was in school. I did attend a boarding school on my reservation when I was very young. But again, my experience is very much different from my mother's experience, is different from my grandmother's experience. Certainly my grandmother, for example, was part of that generation who experienced, again, some of the tragic tragic events that occurred within these boarding schools, very much different. By the time I had gone through the boarding school system when I was young, the United States government had transformed the educational system such that we were permitted to finally learn our language and start to learn a little bit of our history. And there were more the curriculum incorporated a lot more of our traditional values and beliefs and oral traditions. But going back again to my early experience, I made the transition from our boarding school system into a public school system, which was run by the state of Arizona.
Was this in high school?
Actually, this started in elementary school. So like we call it the primary school, from like preschool on up to second grade, and then from third grade on is, elementary and, junior high and high school. But the public school system existed for us from like third grade on.
Okay.
But that, because the schools were run by the state of Arizona, by the state government, they didn't incorporate any of Navajo language. Certainly didn't learn very much at all about Navajo culture, Navajo traditions. That learning had to take place at home, unfortunately. And for a lot of students who didn't have access to grandparents or parents who spoke the language or knew those traditions, sadly, many of them didn't pick up the language and don't speak the language, sadly. I had learned about art history in school only because I had a teacher who went out of their way to make sure that in teaching us, for example, in our history classes, that while we were learning about United States history, that she went to go find books and articles wherever she could to incorporate Navajo history.
Yes.
And so it wasn't part of the state curriculum in our schools to have Navajo history. It really took my teacher going out and doing extra research on her own to find that information and make sure that we learned about our own history. That was my experience growing up. It just wasn't something taught to us. It wasn't taught in all the classes.
Yeah, because the state of Arizona, in fact, is home to many tribes, as you said, and nations of the indigenous community in the United States. And the fact that the American public educational institutions in the state itself did not incorporate it in the curriculum, did it create a kind of like alienation from that part of your identity during your formative years?
Yes and no. I was very fortunate that I had teachers who made the extra effort to make sure that I had learned my own history. But I know that that wasn't the case for other teachers who taught the same subjects within other courses in our high school. They decided to stay with the strict curriculum that was given by the state of Arizona. And unfortunately, a lot of my classmates at the time didn't learn the same history, didn't have the same history books that we did. I don't know what my experience would have been had I not learned about Navajo history. I mean, that's a very interesting thought, as to whether I would have gone down the same path,
Yes,
profession, if I hadn't learned about my own history.
yes.
But I will say that it prompted more questions than answers for me, because I did start to notice a difference in certainly the textbooks. What textbooks that I later had, even going into college, that mentioned Native Americans always mentioned Native Americans, on the plains. Like there was information about the Lakota people or the Cherokees in Oklahoma, the Trail of Tears, for example. There was never any mention of my tribe or any other tribes across the United States. And that really perplexed me. I didn't understand, finishing my educational path, why is it that I was learning only about certain tribes and their history, but never about mine?
Yes. So I think those kinds of experiential learning, how then did it guide you to develop the skills and competencies that eventually led you to study, of course, as you've mentioned, the field of law in general, and then eventually indigenous law?
Well, I, what's interesting, I find interesting about myself now is that I'm still learning, even at this stage in my career, the importance of having had learned that early history of my tribe, learning essentially what it means for me to incorporate into the work that I do now my own beliefs, my own values about, really all aspects of life, and certainly the issues that are taking place now. It's been a learning process the entire time for me to figure that out, because it's not quite apparent, to most, I would think, most Native people, Indigenous people, because going through certainly college and then on to law school, there was always, I felt, this, I don't know how to describe it, but every time that I tried to insert my perspective, as a Navajo woman growing up on the Navajo reservation, my comments were always pushed aside, or I have a distinct experience and memory of my first, days in law school and property class, where we
Yes.
started talking about this concept of land rights and how the United States came to develop the property rights system in the United States. And it started right at the period of, when the United States signed its declaration, and, the Indian Wars, and very much glossed over the fact
Right.
that Indigenous people were here first. And how is it that my people, for example, we went from having these recognized rights, and all of a sudden, from the next day, from one day to the next, my people were like citizens of Mexico at one point, or Spain, or and then of course the United States. And I remember asking this question of my professor, and
But
his response to me was, well, Wenona, if you want to learn about the history of Indigenous peoples, this is not the class. Go
really,
across campus, go take a history class,
yes.
but this is not the class for this discussion.
Mhm.
That was the sort of responses that I would always get from my professors anytime I would bring up a topic
Uh-huh.
about Indigenous peoples and Indigenous rights.
Yes. So we're talking about glossing over like history, and of course what may have been included or deleted in history books, as you've mentioned. So what then prompted you, as you've mentioned, there was an interest that was developing you of, yes, you don't want to actually have these experiences that your forebears had experienced. And one way to do that is to be knowledgeable about the law. But the law that you've studied, I'm sure, is based on the Anglo-Saxon concept of a legal system. So, how then did all of these experiential learning skills and competencies then now play into the eventual career trajectory that you pursued eventually? As you said, that's an interesting thought that if you had not learned about your people during your formative years, what could have eventually happened, both to your personal and professional life? Wenona?
Well, upon graduating from law school, I had decided to practice law right away, and in trying to effectuate change, within certainly my community, but really with Indian tribes across the nation, I again had sort of another epiphany and realized, well, most of the laws that are on the books that have a adverse impact on our people
Yes.
are adopted by governmental bodies like the United States Congress.
Mhm.
And that again prompted me to sort of take a different direction in my career, and I decided to pursue politics.
Yes.
And I decided to run for Congress one year. Unfortunately, didn't win my race at the time, but what it led to was I ran for a position within the Arizona legislature, and I did win that election and served in the Arizona legislature as a state representative, representing a district that included 9 of the 22 Indian tribes in Arizona. And so I, you know, having served in the Arizona legislature, I felt that I was in a much better position as an elected official versus being an attorney on the outside to bring about change in our tribal communities through legislation. And so I worked with certainly all of the tribes in our district, excuse me, and actually worked with all 22 Indian tribes across the state to introduce legislation to correct some of the changes that needed to be made in our healthcare system, for example. I actually am the original author of a missing and murdered Indigenous women bill that has now passed through the Arizona legislature. It's the first of its kind. So I've learned that those skills that I've had and I developed as an attorney and even through law school served me very well in the legislature, because then I could, draft legislation and introduce legislation and bring about the change that I wanted to see in our communities.
Mhm. I see. So from the legislature, of course, so now you're going to be on the other end of like practice, in the sense of like you talk about like prosecutions and you talk about like cases. So how has that part of your career been very much different or similar to what you've been doing as a lawmaker in the state legislature?
Well, now having gone back to being an attorney, I served out my term and decided not to run again and returned back to the legal field. It's been an incredible experience for me. I feel like I'm well-rounded. I'm now focused. Most of my work is focused on the federal level. We are. I returned to the legal profession, deciding to work in the health sector, which is a new field for me. It was not a field that I worked in previously before running for office, but because of the work I had done in the legislature,
Right?
working
Yes.
on healthcare, I ended up becoming a healthcare attorney. And I became an attorney. Healthcare. I made the switch back into the field at a very difficult time, because I literally was working as a healthcare attorney for about 6 months before the pandemic started.
Okay.
And last year has just been an incredible learning experience for me. I've had to learn on the go and learn really with everybody else as well. And really, a lot of my focus wasn't necessarily on legal work per se, but really on policies and learning about public health and public health emergencies and preparedness, and helping the tribe that I work for now, the Pascua Yaqui tribe, ensure that they saved lives essentially last year, and I got the necessary vaccines that were needed, and continued to protect the community members from the virus. And so that, again, that essentially was an absolutely eye-opening experience for me to have both the law, the policy, and legal aspects of my skill base come together like that.
Mhm. So, having talked about mostly, of course, about the professional skills that you were able to use in your particular career, what then do you think would be the personal qualities that young people should develop, and specifically if they were members of the Indigenous community, if they wanted to be in your field and in your career?
Well, I first and foremost, one thing I've learned over the years is, figure out what it is that you love to do, that you're passionate about, and stick with it, pursue it. I certainly my field, it can be stressful. It's not always a job. It's not a 8 to 5 job. I work a lot of long hours at various times, and certainly did last year. But I really encourage, anytime I get an opportunity to talk to young people, is that when you're thinking about your educational futures, your path, educational careers, that to not be guided by the financial wealth, or even the fame, if you will, of a certain career, because that's not going to make you happy down the road. That you really have to figure out what it is that inspires you, what motivates you, and go do it. It's just so crucially important that young people nowadays, really focus their time and their effort and their educational experience to go and do the things that they love to do. Because in the end, it makes your life is so much better. Your health, your mental stability, your overall physical well-being is much more important.
Yeah. So I think we've come a little bit full circle into your educational journey, and of course, how that has informed you in terms of your personal and professional development. So, of course, in the end, because we have many young people who are going to be listening to us, what then of the advice and insight can you give to the young people who are now on the cusp of making decisions, both for their personal and professional future, about the factors that they should be considering when they really make these life-changing decisions?
One important um, one thing that I did when I knew that I wanted to go to law school and I wanted to succeed in my educational experience, is that I sought out those people who I knew could help me reach my educational goals. I made sure that I had many mentors throughout my educational experience. And I also made sure that I sought out people who could help me, both mentor me in terms of my career choices, but also in my courses.
Mhm.
I graduated summa cum laude from the Arizona State University. I graduated from the Honors College there and went on to Harvard Law School. And I used to get a lot of students ask me, like, how did you do that? How did you get there? What did you do to prepare? And
Yes.
one thing that I had learned early on when I was at school is that never be afraid to ask for help, ever. I had so many tutors in college. I spent numerous hours after class studying, meeting with tutors, spending a lot of that time preparing and improving my skills. right? I always thought that I was never a strong writer, and I've spent a lot of time with tutors writing and rewriting my essays and my papers and just continuing over a period of the 4 years I was in college, improving those skills so that I could finally be able to apply to school like Harvard and be admitted. And
Yes.
so I just, hard work and just persevere and just stick to it. And I know some folks get, it's hard to move away from home, away from family. And, the other important thing is to seek out those support systems around you and, and make sure to find those individuals who are invested in your success.
Yeah, well, it's been such a pleasure, definitely, to have this discussion and insights from your end. So I think maybe you can give like a few words of support and encouragement, firstly to the young people who are listening to us, also to the members of the Indigenous community whom you advocate for, and definitely, of course, the kind of insight that we would like to listen to as part of humanity. We in the Philippines also have our own indigenous communities who comprise now the minorities, and there's a lot of struggle that they also have to undertake for the protection of their rights in our country. Wenona?
For all the young folks out there, I'm just always truly inspired by all the wonderful work that many of the young people are engaged in at this time. So many young people are leading the way in terms of some of the really pressing issues that we're facing in our lifetime. And I would really hope that as young people that you continue to be passionate about what you're doing, about what you believe in, and continue to work hard and pursue your dreams and don't ever give up. It gets hard at various times. There's obstacles you face, but so long as you keep your eye on the prize and keep pushing forward and reaching for your dreams, you will get there.
Yes.
And when it comes to the Indigenous communities across the world, I just, again, we're facing unprecedented times right now, and climate change is such a big issue for the entire world, for all global communities. And I truly believe that as Indigenous people, the knowledge that we hold will serve its purpose. And I really feel that, our communities will rise to the forefront and will be the ones to, in my heart, I hope that we will be the ones to help save this planet and that we will all be here for future generations to come.
Well, it's been such a wonderful discussion, Winona. So we look forward to meeting very soon, I hope, when you do have the opportunity to join us and join with your brothers and sisters from the other side of the state. And I'm so looking forward, if we can, to meet each other again.
Yes, likewise.
Thank you so much.